What if the neighbor who waved hello every morning was hiding the mind of a serial predator? Let's peel back the mask. Let me paint a picture for you. Imagine living in a quiet suburb. Morning joggers, kids on bikes, neighbors mowing their lawns on Saturday mornings. Now imagine that the man who nods at you from his driveway, the one who keeps his yard neat, sometimes stops to chat about the weather, has a horrifying secret. Not just a little skeleton in the closet. I'm talking about a cemetery's worth of horror. That man was Joseph James DeAngelo. To his neighbors, he was just Joe. A bit grumpy, sure, kept to himself, maybe too much. But no one could have guessed that Joe was actually the Golden State Killer. A man responsible for over 120 burglaries, at least 50 rapes, and 13 known murders. He lived among people, made small talk, even went to work like the rest of us. All the while, he was committing some of the most sadistic and calculated crimes in California's history. Let's break this down, not just what he did, but who he was, and how someone can wear such a convincing mask for decades. And hey, while we dive into this disturbing profile, go ahead and tap that like button if you're fascinated by the psychology behind true crime. It helps others find this story too. So, let's set the scene. Joseph DeAngelo's reign of terror started in the 1970s and stretched well into the 1980s, crisscrossing the state of California. But for decades, no one realized that the Visalia ransacker, the East Area rapist, and the original Night Stalker were all the same person. He started as a prowler, breaking into homes in Visalia, stealing odd things, rearranging furniture. Just weird enough to rattle people. Then, the attacks escalated. He raped, murdered, and disappeared into the night. No fingerprints. No DNA matches. Nothing. It wasn't until 2018, almost 40 years after his last known crime, that DNA genealogy finally led investigators to DeAngelo. And the country collectively gasped. Because this man, the man who had terrorized entire communities, wasn't some wild-eyed drifter. He was a former cop, a family man, a guy who lived quietly in the suburbs for years, hiding in plain sight. Now, let's rewind a bit. To understand how DeAngelo became this monster, we need to look at his beginnings. Born in 1945, DeAngelo grew up in a household riddled with dysfunction. There are reports of abuse, neglect, and an early exposure to trauma. His father was allegedly violent, and his mother had to raise the kids mostly alone. That kind of emotional volatility, it does things to a child's brain. As he got older, people noticed something off. He was intelligent, but distant, reserved. Not the kind of kid who made easy friends. Eventually, he joined the Navy, serving in Vietnam. And after that, he became a police officer. That's important, because for someone like DeAngelo, someone already teetering on the edge, that kind of authority doesn't just offer structure. It offers control. And control would become a major theme in his crimes. But back in those early years, people saw a guy with a job, a uniform, a path. No one saw what was really boiling underneath. That simmering rage, that craving to dominate and inflict fear. It didn't come out of nowhere. It built slowly, in silence, like pressure under the surface. Here's where things get even darker. DeAngelo didn't just kill and vanish. He had a double life, and he played the part to perfection. Husband, father, reliable employee. He even worked as a mechanic at a grocery distribution center for over 2 decades. He showed up on time, went home, and no one suspected a thing. Let's just stop right there. That's the part that messes with your head, right? Because how can a man go from tucking his kids into bed to breaking into someone else's house and committing unspeakable acts? The answer? He was a master of masks. Psychologists point to classic narcissistic and psychopathic traits. No real empathy, no genuine remorse, and an ability to compartmentalize. He didn't see people as people. He saw them as things. Things to control. Things to humiliate. That's where he got his sense of power. And that power? It wasn't random. It was ritualized, deliberate. He stalked victims for days, sometimes weeks. He studied their habits. He broke in beforehand to leave ropes or unlock doors. That's not impulse. That's obsession. What makes it even more chilling is that he probably sat across from his neighbors at block parties. Maybe even helped someone jumpstart a car or offered to keep an eye on their house while they were away. All the while, his mind was crawling with dark fantasies he had every intention of fulfilling. And here's the kicker. His routine was his armor. He stuck to habits, patterns, repetition, like clockwork. That's how he kept the mask intact. Now, I know this is heavy stuff, but understanding the psychology of a man like D'Angelo isn't about just recounting crimes. It's about asking the deeper question. How many people wear masks we never see through? If you're already gripped by this dark unraveling, go ahead and hit that like button. It helps more curious minds find this story. In part 2, we're going to dive into how his crimes escalated, how fear became his favorite weapon, and what his rituals say about the predator beneath the persona. Don't miss it. And hey, if you've got thoughts already, drop them in the comments. Let's unpack this monster together. Let's talk tactics. D'Angelo didn't just commit crimes, he engineered them. It started small. He was known first as the Visalia ransacker, breaking into homes, rifling through drawers, stealing bizarre things like single earrings or family photos. Not valuable stuff, just personal. It was never about money. It was about violating space, testing boundaries. But that was just the prelude. Soon, he escalated. As the East Area rapist, he began stalking women in their homes. He'd spend days learning their routines. He'd sneak in when no one was home, unlock sliding doors, sometimes even plant ligatures under the bed for later. Then, he'd return, armed, masked, and ready to destroy lives. And when rape wasn't enough to satisfy his sickness, he evolved into the original Night Stalker, combining sexual assault with murder. His victims went from terrified survivors to silenced witnesses. What made it even more terrifying? He'd sometimes call his victims before and after the attacks, whispering threats, repeating phrases like, "I'm going to kill you." Sometimes years later, just to keep the fear alive. He didn't want them to heal. He wanted them to live in fear, indefinitely. That's not just sadism. That's psychological warfare. Control wasn't part of his crimes. It was the crime. D'Angelo was obsessed with domination. He tied his victims tightly, sometimes double or triple knotting bindings. He blindfolded them, gagged them. He often made the male partner lie face down while he assaulted the female, placing dishes on the man's back and warning that if they moved, they'd all die. It wasn't just about sex. It was about complete submission. And when you think about his life as a former police officer, it makes a twisted kind of sense. He craved authority, uniforms, control over situations. But when he lost his badge, he created his own dark jurisdiction, his own sick brand of law and order, where he made the rules and victims were objects. It was ritualistic. He repeated behaviors like he was checking boxes on a script. Everything from the way he entered, to how he tied knots, to the order of his verbal threats. It was all controlled, like a stage performance. And when you compare that to classic psychopathic traits, we're talking lack of empathy, grandiose sense of self, manipulation, shallow emotions, it checks nearly every box. He didn't feel guilt. He felt entitlement. He deserved power. And if society wouldn't give it to him, he'd take it. D'Angelo wasn't a chaotic killer. He was a calculating one. Smart, patient, methodical. He didn't just get lucky avoiding capture for decades. He studied how to get away with it. As a former cop, he knew police procedures. He understood how evidence worked. He wore gloves, avoided leaving fingerprints, parked far from crime scenes. Even in the 1970s, long before modern forensics, he was ahead of the curve. Some believe he kept meticulous records, notes, keepsakes, possibly even journals, items that fed his fantasies later. Unfortunately, most of this evidence was never recovered. But we know from survivor accounts that he had scripts, repeated phrases, patterns, clear signs of premeditation and mental rehearsal. There's this theory floating around in criminal psychology called cognitive rehearsal. It's when an offender fantasizes and mentally runs through their crimes like dress rehearsals. And it fits D'Angelo perfectly. You've got a guy who would spend weeks stalking homes, walking dogs through neighborhoods to case layouts, mapping escape routes, learning the rhythms of people's lives. That's not just obsession. That's someone living inside the crime before it even happens. Now here's a question worth chewing on. Did he struggle with what he was doing? Or did he feel nothing at all? This is where opinions split. Some psychologists argue that D'Angelo experienced no real inner conflict. He had the traits of a classic psychopath: superficial charm, manipulativeness, zero empathy, complete compartmentalization. He could commit heinous acts and go home to dinner like it was just another day at the office. Others wonder if, buried somewhere deep, he wrestled with urges he couldn't control. After all, there were gaps in his crimes. Periods of quiet. Moments where it seemed like the spree was over. Was that because he was trying to stop? Or simply biding time? We may never know. He hasn't spoken in detail about motives. In court, he barely mumbled a word. But here's the eerie part. The silence feels like part of the same pattern. That need for control. Even when exposed, even when shackled, Joseph D'Angelo refused to give anyone insight into who he really was. He wore that mask until the very end. Now I want to hear from you. Drop your thoughts in the comments. What do you think truly drove him? Was it pure evil? A fractured mind? Or something else altogether? And if you're into deep dives like this, make sure to subscribe. We're just getting started. So far, we've dissected the mind behind the mask and the rituals that turned a neighborly man into a calculated predator. Now let's talk about the day the mask finally cracked. 4 decades, he was a ghost, a whisper, a silhouette in a hallway. But in 2018, that ghost got a name. Joseph James D'Angelo was finally caught. And the image? It wasn't what anyone expected. It was a warm April day in 2018 when the world finally saw the face of the Golden State Killer. But how did they catch him? After all these years? The answer lies in something you probably have sitting in a drawer at home: a DNA swab. It started with a brilliant use of genetic genealogy. Investigators uploaded DNA from one of the crime scenes into a public genealogy database, similar to sites like 23andMe or GEDmatch. From there, they matched partial DNA to distant relatives. And through a meticulous process of elimination, building out family trees, analyzing birthplaces, timelines, and police records, they landed on D'Angelo. And there he was, living in the Sacramento suburbs. Retired cop, grandfather, gardening in his front yard, shopping at local stores. A man in his 70s, frail-looking, quiet. Not exactly the monster anyone imagined. But then again, isn't that the most chilling part? It wasn't a mythical beast. It was someone's neighbor, someone's dad, someone who'd lived a second life so convincingly, he fooled everyone around him. When the news broke, it sent a shockwave across the country. Survivors who had lived in fear for decades suddenly had a name, a face, a closure they never thought possible. Law enforcement officers who had spent their entire careers chasing a phantom finally got to see justice peek out from behind the curtain. And the public? We were stunned. Because what we saw wasn't a fanged villain. It was a balding man in a wheelchair, being rolled into a courtroom, whispering his name like a forgotten child. And that, right there, was part of the performance. Let's talk about that persona. When D'Angelo appeared in court, he looked broken, physically weak, hunched over, barely audible. At times, it was like he wasn't even present, just a hollowed-out shell of a man. But here's the question. Was it real? Because many believe it was an act, a carefully curated performance to appear vulnerable and harmless. A man suddenly too old, too tired, too sick to be the monster everyone was expecting. And to be clear, this wasn't a man who aged into remorse. There was no genuine apology, no raw confession. He pled guilty, yes, but only after the evidence was irrefutable. Only after he knew there was no escape. Psychologists have a name for this kind of behavior: performative frailty. It's when a suspect exaggerates illness, weakness, or confusion to evoke sympathy or reduce punishment. And D'Angelo played the part like a seasoned actor. But the survivors? They weren't fooled. At his sentencing, survivor after survivor stood in front of that courtroom and faced the man who once held them hostage in their own homes. Some spoke with rage, others with pain, many with trembling hands but defiant hearts. But all of them shared one thing: they took back the power he stole. These weren't just statements. They were reclamations of identity, of agency, of life. Some told him he didn't matter anymore. Others reminded him of every scream, every moment of horror that he probably thought they'd forgotten. He sat there in silence, occasionally twitching or nodding, but he never looked truly present. And that right there, that disconnection, is what makes men like him so terrifying. The absence of remorse, the absence of humanity. So we come to the final question. Could he have stopped? Some argue that D'Angelo's periods of quiet, like the long gap in the 90s, suggest he could stop. That maybe, once he aged, the urges dulled. Or maybe he got scared, grew tired. But others say, no, this wasn't a matter of control. It was a matter of opportunity. His crimes weren't about need. They were about desire. And when the risk got too high, when forensic science evolved, he adapted. He hid the monster. He didn't kill it. Joseph D'Angelo didn't just teach us about the depths of depravity. He showed us how easy it is to hide in plain sight. A man with a badge. A man with a smile. A man with a yard full of roses and a head full of horrors. So what does this case teach us? It teaches us that serial offenders don't always look like monsters. Sometimes, they wear uniforms. Sometimes, they coach Little League. Sometimes, they're already in your neighborhood. That's why psychological profiling matters. That's why we study patterns, behaviors, escalation, and trauma. Because monsters don't come with warning labels, but their behaviors often do. And the more we learn, the more we understand, the better we become at catching them, before they disappear behind another mask. If you made it this far, thank you for diving deep. Don't forget to subscribe. We've got more haunting minds to explore. And if this story got under your skin, share it with someone. Because these conversations matter. Stay curious. Stay aware. And remember, the most dangerous monsters are often the ones that look the most ordinary.